Good afternoon, everybody. We are delighted to have Professor Babones join us. He has just released a remarkable paper, which is titled "The Weaponization of Caste in America." And the paper has just been released by the Indian Century Roundtable, of which Professor Babones is the founder and the leader of that organization. We'll be having a broad-ranging discussion with Professor Babones. He does not necessarily need an introduction. He has been in the news for quite some time. He has presented what we would call a refreshing take at data-driven analysis and opinions about India that are more based on facts and figures than opinions and than based on prejudices and opinions from others. So we are absolutely delighted to have Professor Babones join us. Just a quick note. We'll put up a small biography of Professor Babones so people can take a look at it. All right, let me just share my screen for a second here. Got that. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So, he's an associate professor at the University of Sydney. He's a quantitative comparative sociologist, and his current research focuses on the political sociology of democracy. In the past, he's also published on economic development in post-socialist transition economies and quantitative methods for cross-national comparisons. The Indian Century Roundtable, an organization that is based in Australia, one of its primary goals is, as it states on its website, as India grows in economic and strategic importance, the world needs objective information on India and its democratic model. We intend to provide that information in a facts, not feelings basis. I think that is very critical in how we look at research and generally opinions about India. So this paper is kind of path-breaking, and we will have Professor Babones talk about some of the more critical issues that are in there. So let me start, Professor. Let me start with the takeaways. And one part of the takeaway that kind of caught my attention is anti-Hindu activism overlaps substantially with anti-Semitic activism in terms of both strategy and participating organizations. So can we start from there? Can you give us a little bit of expand a little bit on what you mean by that?
If you consider the most emblematic anti-Hindu effort of the past year, the effort to have California ban caste-based discrimination under SB 403 that was recently vetoed by Governor Gavin Newsom. If you look at the list of organizations that were in the coalition to support SB 403, you'll see a list of mainly Muslim, Sikh, labor organizations, student organizations, academic associations. And if you go through that list and you look for their position on Palestine, you'll find the majority of those organizations have also signed on to efforts to support the Palestinian cause and resist Israel in the Middle East. Now, that's no coincidence. The same kinds of organizations are using the same kinds of tactics to attack Hindus as have long attempted to attack Israel and to attack Jews in the United States through the mechanism of labeling them as Zionist and trying to associate Zionism with colonialism and with repression of Palestinians. It is the same kind of bait and switch. And by bait and switch, what I mean is you say you're attacking one thing when in fact you're attacking something else. And you hope that the people you're speaking to don't realize that you've brought them in with saying, we want to condemn attacks on hospitals. That's how you bring people in. And then you switch them over to, and we're condemning Israel. In the same way, you bait people in with, we just want to prevent caste-based discrimination. Well, everybody agrees with that. And then it's switched over to, and we want to condemn Hindus for causing this. right? And many of the organizations that sign on to these efforts may be even unaware that they're signing on to anti-Hindu efforts, in the same way that many organizations that sign on to anti-Semitic efforts may not realize that they're doing so, but they're being fooled into it by, in most cases, activists who really have little regard for the truth. Instead, what they really want is just to create an appearance of consensus. An appearance of consensus that condemns Hindus in the United States, or an appearance of consensus that condemns Israel.
Yeah, I would definitely agree on that. I mean, horrible as the situation on campuses has been, all of us in CoHNA and the Hindu world got a foretaste of it back in 2021 with the Dismantling Global Hindutva conference, when the 20th anniversary of 9/11 was a bait and switch, right? First of all, they brought Hindutva, even if you assume Hindutva is a negative philosophy, which we certainly don't. It was, what does Hindutva have to do with 9/11? And then the bait and switch that you're talking about, it was supposed to be about Hindutva, not Hinduism. Yet speaker after speaker at Dismantling Global Hindutva basically said Hindutva and Hinduism are the same and need to be demolished.
Right. So you mentioned, Professor, you mentioned the notion of a grievance that is being addressed and a bait and switch that is kind of used to address those kinds of grievances. So I want to put something up from your paper, which I thought was kind of an interesting observation, where you make the point that understanding that most Americans know virtually nothing about Hindus or the Hindu faith, their primary purpose is not to redress a grievance, but to generate a narrative. So can you speak about what do you think the narrative is that is being created here?
Let's be clear that in both the Seattle anti-caste ordinance and in the California SB 403 controversy, in both cases, those proposing the new laws admitted up front, they actually put it right in their proposed laws, that their proposals would not change existing law. They were simply being declaratory, which is to say, they weren't addressing any new problem. Caste-based discrimination is already prohibited under most U.S. civil rights legislation. What they wanted to do was declare that there was a problem of caste-based discrimination. And so they weren't trying to address any actual problem. And many of your listeners will be aware of the Cisco case in California. The human rights case against Cisco, or I'm sorry, the civil rights case against Cisco was brought in the absence of SB 403. That is, even without this law, the California civil rights authorities were able to bring a case against Cisco Systems alleging caste-based discrimination. So there's no actual grievance to be answered. Instead, the purpose of SB 403, the purpose of the Seattle anti-caste ordinance, the purpose of all of these campus resolutions to ban caste-based discrimination on campus, the purpose of the California state university systems anti-caste efforts, the purpose of all of this is to associate the Hindu faith with casteism. Now, all of these efforts have been resisted by mainstream, broad-based membership organizations involving Hindus. Despite the fact that broad-based Hindu civil society organizations have been fighting against caste-based discrimination for more than a century, right? This is not a problem of the organized Hindu faith. To the extent that there's any caste-based discrimination, it's a residual feature of Indian society that has been fought by Hindus throughout the modern era, certainly throughout the post-independence era in India. So why are Hindu organizations, why are organizations like CoHNA militating against these new rules, these new laws? And the reason is obvious to anyone who spends a few hours studying the issue. The reason is that these new laws are not being proposed for the purpose of banning caste-based discrimination. Banning caste-based discrimination is something that everyone agrees on, and that everyone agrees is already covered by current law. The purpose of these efforts is to stigmatize and vilify Hindus. And thus, it's no surprise that organizations like CoHNA, like the Hindu American Foundation, like Hindu Pact, are resisting these efforts. They're not resisting them because they want to discriminate on the basis of caste. That's already illegal. They're opposing them because these efforts are transparently intended to disparage Hindus.
Right, and the weapon of choice, every weapon needs some kind of a delivery mechanism, and the delivery mechanism for this particular weapon of choice seems to be the notion that the Dalits who have immigrated to the United States are facing the same kind of oppression that B.R. Ambedkar saw back in the day, and therefore he felt it was necessary to bring it into the Indian Constitution. So I want to put up another extract from the paper that you mentioned, which is, in this case, the question that is being asked is, the supposed need to protect Dalits from caste-based discrimination has become the most potent tactic, but strangely, they all centered on relatively elite Dalits. Then you go on to describe the role that the immigrant Dalits play in that. So you've done some work in kind of analyzing some of the data that shows the distribution of or the demographics of the self-identified Dalit population in the United States. What are your thoughts on that? What have you observed?
Well, the first thing you realize is that Dalit is not a caste. Dalit is a political category that is part of a movement. Now, it's a movement that is ultimately based on caste, but any law to ban caste-based discrimination would not be specifically banning discrimination against Dalits. Yet, all of these efforts have been preceded by long preambles that recite a list of supposed discrimination against Dalits, mainly focused on historical discrimination in the British colonial era, going back 100 years or more in India. Virtually no evidence has been adduced of actual discrimination against Dalits in the United States. Now, of course, the small number of Dalits in the United States form a highly rarefied subset of the Indian Dalit population, because obviously it's difficult to get to the United States. So we're not talking about people who clean toilets, who work as security guards, who are office cleaners at night. We're talking about people who mainly have postgraduate degrees, who are working in elite institutions like top universities and Silicon Valley firms. Now, there are probably around 20 to 25,000 Dalits in the United States. They seem to be a highly elite population. All of the efforts to protect Dalits have focused on protecting them at places like Harvard University, not at protecting them in places like office cleaning companies, right? So we have to get out of the mindset that the Dalit population of the United States is the Dalit population of India of 1910. The Dalit population of the United States in 2023 is an extraordinarily elite population. Now, of course, it's wrong to discriminate against elite people, just like it's wrong to discriminate against everybody, but it's hardly a major social policy priority to protect extraordinarily privileged, extraordinarily high-income individuals against a form of discrimination that we have no evidence existed historically in the United States, and we have no evidence exists currently in the United States. Instead, we see, and to abuse that metaphor again, we see a bait and switch, where allegations of historical discrimination against Dalits in India are being used to justify the need for protections for extraordinarily elite Americans in the 21st century.
So Pushpitaji, you were involved closely with the movement in both in support of and opposition to. You had a chance to look at some of these people in the eye who are supporting this. So what are your thoughts on Professor Babones' comments about the nature of the people who are supporting SB 403 in California? You had a chance to interact with some of them, did you not?
Yes. I would say, the leaders are extremely elite. I mean, they come from the top Ivy Leagues of the Western world, and that's in any sense of the way there, and also a lot of second generation voices. In fact, that is something that we called out a lot, because we also interacted with folks who are also Dalit and Bahujan, who worked very hard to oppose it, but their voices were always cut down because they're just not that articulate. They don't have access to the privilege honestly. The privilege that comes with being an Ivy League academic, or the privilege that comes, with being, educated at these institutions and having the networks that allow you to amplify the message. And, we saw that over and over again, like in Google, right? Where one of the most elite companies in elite Silicon Valley, and how that whole situation played out. I think you talk about it too, right, Professor Babones?
Yes, absolutely. It's a very elite group from everything we've seen. Everybody involved is at a very high level in American society.
And back to the original case, Cisco itself, right, which started this whole thing. As castegate.org showed, and as Sundar Iyer and Compella have now come forward with their testimony, we find that California Civil Rights Department, to quote Sundar Iyer, was waging this major battle on behalf of an employee who was compensated in the millions. So again, it's really interesting, given all the problems that California has, where the emphasis has been.
Well, it's very odd for a state to be spending so much money to protect a millionaire. It's very odd that if there is widespread discrimination against Dalits, that other Dalits have not joined in this lawsuit as additional complainants in the case. We would have expected that if there was widespread discrimination. And on top of that, it's very odd that this whole battle, or as I call it, culture war, it even exists because everybody on all sides of this culture war, everybody agrees that caste-based discrimination is a bad thing. This simply isn't even in dispute. What's disputed is the reason, the motivations behind various actors in this drama. And it's very clear as an outsider, and I want to be clear, I come to this as a non-Hindu, as a non-Indian, as an academic who's just looking at the facts. This paper has not been commissioned by anybody. I'm not being paid for the paper. I don't even get paid by my own not-for-profit for the paper. That is, everything I do for the Indian Central Roundtable is pro bono. The money we raise is used to pay other people, not to pay me for my papers. So I'm a complete independent outside analyst looking at this from the outside and asking, what's going on here? And once you start trawling through all of the material, it quickly becomes clear that there's an organized campaign. That organized campaign is led by Indian Muslim groups, in particular the American Indian Muslim Council, by a series of Sikh Khalistani groups. Again, not ordinary Sikhs, not by ordinary Gurdwaras, but by a Khalistani supporting group of Sikhs. And then they've brought in Equality Labs, which is fundamentally one person, Tenmoji Sundararajan, forgive me if I've pronounced that incorrectly, who fronts this organization and who has over a period of, I guess, around 10 years produced, I think, 6 reports. I mean, this is not a very active organization, but that one face of Sundararajan is crucial, because that one person, just having a single articulate elite Dalit who's able to front for this coalition, gives the others who have really no fundamental interest in Dalit rights. I mean, with all due respect to Indian American Muslims, with all due respects to Indian American Sikhs, I doubt redressing concerns of discrimination against Dalits would be one of their top priorities. I mean, these are not-for-profit organizations. All of us who've worked in the not-for-profit world understand how scarce resources are, how we have to be very strategic in choosing how we use resources. I would expect Sikh organizations to be primarily focused on redressing problems affecting Sikhs. I would expect Muslim civil society organizations to be primarily focused on redressing problems directly affecting Muslims. That both of these sorts of organizations have decided that one of their top spending priorities is to support Sundararajan's campaign against supposed caste-based discrimination in America strongly suggests, circumstantially, but very strongly suggests, that this is a strategic offensive in a diaspora culture war. It's not a genuine expression of concern on the part of these organizations.
So let's talk about.
And Suresh, if you want to quickly show the picture that I just texted to you, But back to the Sikh voices that you were talking about, it's interesting that we find only one set of organizations, because we did have some iconic, we did have protests on both sides. And one of the Sikh gentlemen actually gave testimony against this bill at the Judiciary Committee hearing when it happened in the Assembly. So, it's very important to make those distinctions as well.
Right.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I mean, I'm sitting at my desktop, so I'm not able to switch rapidly from a text to a desktop. But Professor Babones, I wanted to go back to something that you mentioned. Two things. One is you rightly pointed out that you are looking at this as an outsider. You're looking at it from a data perspective, and you're saying, okay, what is the data really telling us? And so there are two aspects to this data that I wanted to highlight. In your paper, you mentioned these two things, and I'm curious to hear your take as an academic. First is, you mentioned that there's a lot of debate about exactly how many people in the United States currently identify as Dalit. What is the true size of the Dalit population? And then there's a fascinating bit of information there where a figure is reported by Tinku Ray for WGBH Boston, which is a PBS affiliate, The World, right, the Pulitzer Center, the whole bunch of media organizations, but you could find no link for this figure. So the first question then is, okay, where is all this data, supposed data, coming from? And in a related note, much of the data that is being proposed by people who are pushing these caste discrimination legislation, et cetera, they all point to the exact same report, which is this 2016 Equality Lab survey. And your comment in the paper is, all evidence suggests that the 2016 Equality Lab survey should not be taken seriously.
Right.
Now, those are strong words coming from a person who is, you are a statistics professor. You work in this. Yep,
I teach statistics.
World. Yeah, so this is your bailiwick, so to speak. So tell us a little bit about this paucity of data.
First, the Tinku Ray article immediately popped out at me because I was looking for evidence of this supposed 2001 survey that showed that 1.5% of Indian Americans are of Dalit background. And I couldn't find any reference to this figure that predated that. I believe it was a 2018 article by Tinku Ray, which strongly suggested that the number didn't exist. I mean, it's very difficult for a number to be in the public sphere for 16, 17 years and then only finally get mentioned in a 2018 article. I literally went year by year, searching Google Scholar, looking for this figure. It just wasn't there. Then in Ray's article, the figure, which is a highly professional article where every single figure had a link. And as you would expect for someone being supported by the Pulitzer Center, you'd expect a very well-documented article. Every figure in the article had a link, except this one figure, right? So it was initially a red flag, like, okay, something's wrong with this figure. I can't trace it anywhere. I contacted the University of Pennsylvania, to whom it was credited. They said they had no such report. They sent me to a former director of the center at the University of Pennsylvania, who told me that this figure appears to be taken from his book because he's the one who conducted the survey in 2001, but the book was only published much later. And the book doesn't actually have that figure of 1.5%. It says maximum of 2%. Okay, so there's no exact figure presented in the book. And even that maximum 2% figure is not specifically for self-identifying Dalits. It's for people who are either Dalit or scheduled caste background. And we have to remember that Dalit is not a legally defined term in India or anywhere else. Dalit is a self-identifying political claim. Scheduled caste is an actual civil term, right? So people who are scheduled members of scheduled castes may not necessarily identify as being Dalit. Okay, so that was, for me, it raised red flags. I contacted the reporter. She did ultimately get back to me, saying that she would look into her notes, and I have not yet heard from her. Now, to be fair, this paper was written very recently, and so she's had 2 weeks to get back to me. It may take longer. I admit that, but I'm reasonably certain that the figure is a rough estimate that she made at the time based on what she read in this book. Okay. Now, and the more important point, the Equality Lab survey. The Equality Lab survey used what we call snowball sampling, which means it was sent out to friends of the author of Sundararajan. who then sent it to their friends, who sent it to their friends. And it was explicitly sent to Dalit rights groups and Dalit rights activists online. So Facebook groups and student groups who were active around Dalit rights. The survey was very poorly conducted, so there are quality problems with the survey, but the fundamental problem is that it simply is not a representative sample. It's a sample of people who are active in Dalit rights organizations, and you might expect them to have a particular axe to grind. There's no surprise there. It's similar to when we look for evidence of, I mean, I've been writing about similar things, and forgive me, I know this may not be of interest to listeners, but as you said, I'm a statistician and I do lots of comparative statistics. We've had a lot of work in Australia on sexual harassment on university campuses. And the surveys go out through activist organizations to mostly to women asking, do you feel you want to report sexual harassment? And of course, women who want to report sexual harassment are highly motivated to answer this survey. Women who've never faced sexual harassment are much less motivated to answer survey, and they go out through organizations that are providing help for victims of sexual harassment. Now, that's not to say sexual harassment doesn't exist. It's to say we can't trust this survey to ascertain the size of the problem. And in a similar way, we can't trust a survey of mostly graduate student Dalit rights activists to tell us what the true situation is about the situations faced by Dalits in America. Now, there are also some other red flags about the survey. So, for example, at one point in the survey report, it said 26% of Dalits had faced physical violence on account of their caste. Now, that's an enormous number. I mean, a quarter of people, I mean, that raises images of people with baseball bats going after Dalits, hounding them out of Google and Microsoft and Harvard. Yet at a different point in the same report, it said that 25% have reported facing either verbal or physical violence. Well, wait a minute. If 26% faced physical violence, at least 26% had to have faced physical or verbal violence. So there are inconsistencies in the report itself. It beggars belief that 2/3 of American Dalits face caste-based discrimination when most of them probably aren't even working for other Indians, which is to say, it implies that at least 2/3 of those Dalits must be working for Indians if they're facing caste-based discrimination. Well, I guess that's conceivable. It's not impossible. I mean, we know that quote unquote Indians are everywhere in tech, but again, it beggars belief because the number of Indian bosses that these people must have is just astronomical. I mean, once we account for the fact that there are non-Indians who work in tech, who work at universities, for that matter, 40% of the sample 49% of the sample, I believe, consisted of actual graduate students. Well, are their bosses? I mean, are they all graduate students who are working in their part-time university jobs for other Indians? It's possible theoretically, but it is inconceivable practically. So the numbers just don't add up.
Right, and it also kind of beggars belief, as you say, that with this large number of highly qualified, technically qualified people, presumably there are then therefore no Dalit managers either. Because if some of the discrimination was coming from managers, and presumably some of them were also Dalit managers, so are they being accused? So it's
look, to make it clear, to people who aren't following closely, if every single American Dalit faces discrimination at work from every single non-Dalit Hindu manager, still the 2/3 figure, the 67% figure, is only possible if at least 2/3 of Dalits have managers who are themselves Indian. That just seems inconceivable. That 1/3 of them might, that half, but that the majority of Dalits in America, and there are only 25,000 or so Dalits in America, that the majority of them actually work for Hindus, is in a country that is 1% Hindu, is just inconceivable.
So
I think
So,
talking of data, right? I mean, your report also references the Carnegie study, and I think the Carnegie study had also validated a lot of the issues that you're talking about in terms of the data, the poor quality of data of the Equality Lab survey. And in fact, footnote 29 had even said that this data is really not scientific, just exactly what you're saying for very similar reasons.
Yeah.
But also, but we've already seen that facts sometimes are just put aside. So we have seen that, the Carnegie report was put aside. You brought up the issue of, is it really realistic that these Dalits are working for Hindu managers all the time, or in entirely Hindu setups, right? And we can see that facts have already been twisted, because in the CRD lawsuit that was filed by California, again in the Cisco case, there were actually claims made that Sundar Iyer's team was entirely South Asian, which again, to anybody who knows Silicon Valley, that just defied, like, it didn't make sense, because most teams here are a mix of, different ethnicities, if you really want to go down that rat hole. But they're always a mix of, and just like his team was, but those even demographic facts were just put aside.
Yeah. Look, the demographic claims being made beggar belief. They're simply not possible. But that said, that's not even the real issue here. The real issue here, I mean, if there were caste-based discrimination in America, we would all condemn it and want to fight it. The real issue here is that none of these efforts are about caste-based discrimination. They're all about associating caste with the Hindu faith in the American mind. So, for example, almost all of these open letters, claims, legislation, almost all of them start with a preamble that says something along the lines of, whereas the United Nations has found that Dalits faced serious discrimination in India. Okay, now, that claim may or may not be true. When you chase back that United Nations claim itself is based on an unreferenced claim that seems to refer back to pre-independence India. Okay, leave that aside. Even if we take that at face value, why would a law against caste discrimination in the United States cite as evidence the fact that historically there has been anti-Dalit discrimination in India? The reason is that they're trying to create the association between the Hindu faith and caste-based discrimination. And unfortunately for American Hindus, they're trapped in this because the ultimate goal here is not to vilify Hindus. The ultimate goal here is to vilify India in the eyes of Americans. Now, most Americans simply think of India as a Hindu country. We all know that's not true. We all know that that India has a secular constitution, it has secular laws, that India has large religious minorities, that only about 80% of Indians are Hindus. They may not all be practicing. Everyone listening to this video is aware of that. But most Americans are not. To most Americans, being Indian and being Hindu are conflated in their mind. And so allegations against American Hindus are ultimately driven by the attempt to vilify India. And we see that because the prime movers in this anti-Hindu effort in the United States, the prime movers are supporters of independence for Kashmir, or ultimately for Pakistani rule over Kashmir, and supporters of an independent Khalistan. Okay, that is, the prime movers are not trying to harm their Hindu neighbors in the United States. The prime movers ultimately want to see a decline in U.S. support for India, and they view attacking Hindus as a way to tar India with negative publicity.
Yeah, it's another bait and switch that we see that you talk about, because all the language talks about South Asia, but all the data you point out refers only to either historical India, and even a lot of the stories that we hear, they seem to come only from the Hindu majority countries of Nepal and India. Despite all the South Asian reference, I found no references to the Dalit populations that live in Bangladesh and Pakistan, for example. In fact, massive majorities of Hindus in Pakistan and Bangladesh are Dalit. So, and we know that those populations have undergone a slow genocide. In the case of Bangladesh, going from 23% to 8%. So you'd think that at some point in all this literature about atrocity against Dalits, that would come up, but very mysteriously missing. The concern for the Dalits in South Asia.
Look, that's not all that's mysteriously missing. Much more mysteriously missing is why isn't the American Indian Muslim Council, why isn't it concerned with discrimination against Muslims? There's certainly lots of Islamophobia in the United States, and within Muslim mosques, there's lots of discrimination within the Muslim community. There's a lot of caste-based discrimination within mosques, within the Muslim community. There's also gender-based discrimination. Why are they so concerned with this issue that is external to their own community? And this one issue, they haven't taken up the cause, for example, of discrimination against indigenous peoples from Latin America, who in California form a very large population and who are doubly disadvantaged by being, not only Latin American, but non-Spanish speaking Latin Americans, people who are, like Aztec and Mayan languages. Why are they concerned with these super advantaged, 25,000 super advantaged Dalits, instead of with discrimination against this extremely disadvantaged, intersectionally disadvantaged group in California? Yeah, well, they're concerned because of their larger political battles, right? Let's just call a spade a spade. This is not about actual caste discrimination. It's not even really about Hindus. It's about attacking India and finding support for Pakistan in its long-running battle with India.
Yeah, it's interesting you make that point, because all the legislative language that we see, they kind of try to walk that very, very thin line between explicitly attacking Hinduism and yet, which of course, state sponsorship or opposition to a religion would be constitutionally invalid in the United States, and at the same time kind of wink wink nudge nudge, this is really a Hindu problem. So one of the and I'm curious to hear your thoughts about this as a sociologist and somebody who researches this, is you mentioned that castes are well defined, historically endogamous groups that are present in all South Asian societies. They're typically patrilineal and often associated with a particular surname, etc. But don't we have similar systems pretty much in every society? Don't we have some level of endogamy, some level of patrilineal surname-based guilds, surname-based groups, and so on and so on? I mean, is there any society around the world that would not fit this particular definition of caste as used in SB 403 and as you described here?
Look, I don't know if that's true. I'm not enough of an expert on social systems around the world to really properly answer that question. I just like to emphasize that it doesn't matter, right? So the organizations, let's take SB 403 as the archetypical example. The organizations that promoted SB 403, yes, were very careful to say caste exists in many different countries. This is not about India, it's about all of South Asia and even beyond South Asia to Korea and Japan. And, okay, they're very careful to say that. And they say that because they're perfectly aware that to the ordinary American, and not just the ordinary American member of the public, the ordinary American journalist, caste is an Indian problem. Right. So they don't have to make the explicit association because they're relying on the fact that their audience already makes the association. So when the journalist hears that this is an anti-caste bill, the journalist will automatically look for examples of caste-based discrimination in India. That journalist is not going to go to Korea and try to see how this bill might be motivated by caste in Korea being exported to the United States. Look at all the press coverage. All the press coverage focuses on India and the Indian American community. There may be a pro forma acknowledgement in the bill saying that caste is not specifically related to India. Yeah, everyone knows this is about India. And everyone knows it's about Hindus. Even if they don't mention the Hindu faith, everyone knows that it's about Hindus. And that's specifically sparked by the substitution of Dalit for caste. So the legal language all says caste, 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 which is a civil category. The motivational statements for the bills all say Dalit, 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 which is a political religious category. That is the entire Dalit rights movement, and especially associated with B.R. Ambedkar. The entire Dalit rights movement is a movement of either reform of the Hindu faith or reform against the Hindu faith, but it's all framed with reference to the Hindu faith. The Dalit rights movement was not seeking rights for Dalits in mosques in India. It was not seeking rights for low caste people in Korea. Right? The Dalit rights movement is fundamentally tied up with the history of the Hindu religion.
I mean, if you look at B.R. Ambedkar's entire works, you can see clearly that his focus was entirely Hinduism. He himself,
I have been born a Hindu, but I will not die a Hindu.
I will be a Buddhist. And he does not have kind words for Islam, by the way. I mean, from if you look at his writings, he's not supporting Islam.
Absolutely not. It's very telling that he converted to Buddhism, not to Islam.
Exactly.
Yes.
So given all this, I mean, so your paper has been kind of groundbreaking in the sense it creates this, it identifies this paradigm of bait and switch. It identifies this weaponization of what is essentially a political categorization and kind of clothes it in the garb of some kind of a religious opposition to Hinduism. So if you had the audience of legislators who were presented with this as an option, what would you ask them to look at? What would you tell them to say, hey, before you sign on to this, check this out? What would you tell them?
I would tell them, don't be useful idiots in someone else's battle. I think most legislators are well-meaning. They want to do good in their communities. I'm not as cynical about politics as most people are. There are a small number of legislators who may get funding from a particular group and attempt to push their legislation because they're getting funding. But you can't get something through a legislature like the California legislature all on the basis of special interest funding. It's very noteworthy that SB 403 only ever had 2 sponsors. The first Muslim Californian member of the California Senate and the first Sikh Californian member of the California Legislative Assembly. Those are the only 2 sponsors. Now, ordinarily, legislation that's broadly popular attracts 10, sometimes 20 sponsors. Everyone wants to be seen to be doing good in the world. The fact that it's only attracted 2 sponsors suggests that the rest of the legislature simply was tricked into thinking, I don't want to be the person who's against, I don't want to be the person who's in favor of caste-based discrimination, so I'll vote for this bill. But they didn't sign on to the bill. Right. And if I could speak to these other legislators, I would say, look, don't be a tool in somebody else's battle. Find out what's going on. And then once you realize that this is something happening, this is the weaponization of the legislative process by petty actors in very small communities, just pull away from it. Don't be part of it. If you're afraid that you don't want to go on record as having voted against something that looks good, abstain. And I think it would be very telling if 80% of the legislature had abstained. That would have sent a strong signal, even in itself. Even if they don't want to go on record as opposing a civil rights bill, they could still abstain.
Yep. So Pushpitaji, I know we are coming up on time. We've taken up.
I just wanted to go back to 2 points that you made in your earlier comment about when Suresh was asking about the overlap between what the data that is presented about Hindus and how you find this in different groups, and the role of the media in it. Now, I know that's not the topic of this particular study, but it is a topic you have spoken about in the past. But is there any plan to look at the data, or did you get any sense of how the data, the language in the laws got presented to the media, through the media to the lay public? Because almost nobody other than the activists fighting or pushing for a law actually read bills. Most of us read a headline or a quick article on the topic, and that's what we move on. So was there any distinction you saw between how the law was presented in Senate and how it was presented in the media that covered it quite extensively.
Media analysis is not my specialty, so I can't give a definitive statistical answer here. There are people who do this kind of statistical work. It's just not in my toolkit. But I can give you a broad impression, which is that with almost all issues to do with the Hindu community and with India or Indians abroad, as with almost always in these issues, the majority of reporting is being broken by people with Indian names. Now, I don't know if they themselves are born in India, children of people born in India. I can't know what their politics are, their backgrounds are. All I can say is that they're people who are likely to be self-interested. And that's a problem. If you look at American reporting on anything to do with China and the Chinese community in the United States, you'll find almost all the names are non-Chinese names. Now, there's nothing wrong with someone with a Chinese name reporting on China. There's nothing wrong with someone with an Indian name reporting on India. But it is telling that when you see 80% of the articles, and not just the bulk of articles, most articles are just repeats of existing articles, 80% of the new news being broken, the articles that are the first to print, that are laying out the issues. When these issues are being laid out by people who, let's face it, whatever our assumptions of journalistic integrity, let's face it, people with Indian names are more likely to have their own personal opinions about an issue like caste than people who don't have Indian names. I don't think, every ordinary person would accept that basic proposition. When that's the situation, we have a problem. Now, I can't say what the bias is of any particular journalist. I don't know that that journalist is biased, and I don't know which way that journalist may be biased. But it is very striking when you see that the source of the reporting is connected in one way or another to the community, and frankly, more connected than it should be. I mean, it's very difficult to report on China and the Chinese community if you don't speak Chinese. And thus you would expect that reporting on, and I use China as an example because China is of a similar size to India. The Chinese American community is a similar size to the Indian American community. There are a lot of parallels between these two groups. For China, there's a major language barrier. And so, if anything, I would expect more of the reporting on China and the Chinese diaspora to come from people with Chinese names because they have the language skills. Yet it's exactly the opposite. India and the Indian diaspora are very accessible to those of us who only speak English. Yet the majority of the reporting is coming from people from that background. And I think that just leads to, that certainly opens the opportunity for bias. I can't say who's biased and who's not, but I can say that the opportunity for bias is there.
Yeah. I also quickly want to show one. I know we're coming on time, but I want to quickly show this one survey that we had found when we were looking at, are Indians unique, when Carnegie came out, and we were looking at Indians uniquely likely to cluster around religion and, region and things like that. And we just found this survey of just mainstream American groups. And you could see that, as expected, the Indian community being heavily immigrant was like 20%, 10%, like, everything under half, because there's just not that many Indians in your neighborhood, everywhere to cluster around by region or religion, or certainly by caste. But when you start to look at religious networks, for example, in the US, you found these, enormously high rates. And I'd love to send this survey to you, and, maybe that's a future project you could look at, or to let us know if you have found any commonalities of the tendency of groups to cluster together based on certain common demographics or values or backgrounds. Is that not normal? Or, because somehow anytime Hindus or Indians cluster together on any common factor, it seems to become something that is disturbing or needs to be called out or broken up.
Look, the clustering is a non-issue, simply put. What is an issue is the reporting. So while I would not be surprised if people of the same background tend to cluster together, I am disappointed that American media organizations, when they want to cover something related to the Indian diaspora, look around. One of two things is happening. Either they're looking around the newsroom and they're saying, you're brown, you should cover brown people, which of course would be terribly racist. Or they're saying, who wants to cover this? And the Indian American is coming forward and saying, I'll cover this. It's an Indian American issue. And if that happens, the editor should be highly suspicious, because there should be an inherent skepticism among editors of the possibility for bias. If people are coming forward and volunteering to report on their own community, the editor should say, thank you, but I'm going to assign Joseph Smith, who has never been to India and has no connection to your community, to report on the community, because Joseph Smith is likely to go hear all sides, make up his own mind, get to the information, whereas somebody who already has networks in the community is likely to use his or her own networks to trust people that he or she is already close to. And this happens on both sides. I mean, for lack of a better word, the pro-Hindu diaspora press also tends to be biased, but they make no claims to be unbiased, right? Or maybe they do make claims, I don't know, but we all expect them to be biased, right? When we see a news organization that is a diaspora news organization staffed entirely by Hindu Americans or Hindu Australians, we're not looking to them for an unbiased view of the issue. Maybe we're looking to them for good reporting, to break news, but we're not looking for them to review all sides, to be honest and open, to interview people of all backgrounds, because they're embedded in the community. But when the Washington Post covers something, or NPR, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, they should not be looking to leverage community ties. They should be doing exactly the opposite. They should be looking to put purely objective reporters into the community to talk to everybody, people who are no more comfortable talking to a Hindu or a Muslim or a Sikh or a Dalit or a Brahmin, someone, frankly, like me, for whom all those are the same, right? I have no propensity to trust Hindus more than I would trust Muslims. Right? It's all the same to me. And that's what the news organizations should be doing. So, you're right that the clustering in the community, there's something special about clustering in the Hindu American community. There's nothing wrong if people want to hang out with each other. The problem is the clustering in the reporting.
So on that note, I know we are coming up on time. So let me go back to sharing Professor Babones' background. The paper will be available at www.indiancentury.org.
Right.
You can follow Professor Babones on his Twitter handle at Professor Babones. We would love to we'd love to hear more reactions from this. I'm sure the paper will get a wide reading, and hopefully it will get people thinking about how to think about this issue a little bit better than they have been doing in the past, and that in itself would have been a massive contribution from the paper. So on that note, thank you, Professor Babones, for taking the time. I know you have a very busy schedule. Thanks for joining with us. Thanks for your thoughts, comments on this. And again, if viewers want to get a copy of the paper, it's available at www.indiancentury.org. And you can follow Professor Babones' Twitter feed at Professor Babones.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Let me stop the recording.